Okay. Hope everyone can hear me. I got my new headphone. I'm John Roncoroni. I'm a weed science farm advisor, at least until the end of June. Stationed in Napa. Been there 13 years, and I've been with the University of California for 38 years, and been doing weed science almost that entire time. So I'm pretty enthusiastic about weeds, and but I hope I can bring that to you. Um, I'm going to just there we go. I'm going to hopefully bring that enthusiasm to you, but we'll see how that works. I don't have any idea how this presentation will is going to go today, um, but hopefully and when I do it in person, hopefully I'm bringing again that interest in weeds. But it may be a little dry on screen, but I'll try and interject where I can. Um, and we'll get started here. I'll share my screen, see if this works. Oh, I'm too far down. Start at the top. And can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right, that's good. So we'll get started. I did want to see if I could take a shot. I'm not an entomologist, but I take a shot at that question about the leaf miners and the nitrogen. I know that in crops where the appearance of the leaf isn't as important, excuse me, we often have more insect pests in a luxuriant growth. So oftentimes, even with more nitrogen, the plants can outgrow it. But with something like chard, where you're really interested in that leaf, that extra nitrogen, that luxuriant growth, oftentimes brings on other insects. So that's sometimes why it's sort of a balance between having them grow and not too much nitrogen. So that's just my little try at entomology. May be wrong, but I think that's what I've heard in the past. So, all right, so I'm going to get started. And you can see here, I just a few quotes that a good garden may have some weeds. And then the speaker on the bottom here is known for some other things, but he's a pretty famous Italian weed scientist. But I've heard he's done some other things too. But then even in the richest soil, if left uncultivated, will produce the rankest of weeds. So just a little philosophy here. This was a picture that was sent to me by one of the grape growers in Napa. You can see, I think this is coyote bush, actually, not really a weed, but these plants just, push right back through. You can see that's not the thinnest of pavements, but it just wasn't quite sealed. So you can really learn a lot about life just from following weeds. So weed identification and biology. First, we're going to start with identification. And if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself real quick, see if we can follow my arrow. I'm going to ask for identification. Oh, sorry. So up here, can anybody tell me what this weed is?
Creep. It's a purslane, right?
Nope.
Euphorbia?
Yeah, it's a euphorbia. What kind?
Spurge.
Spurge. Very good. This one?
I'm not seeing green.
It's your arrow. Oh.
Sorry.
Dandelion.
Let me get this thing is following me around.
Dandelion.
Very good.
Yes.
Down here, very few people get this one.
Pineapple weed?
Nope.
Oh.
This one?
Bermuda grass.
Crabgrass.
Nope.
No.
In the middle?
Italian thistle?
Close,
Thistle?
but not Italian thistle. They are so annual bluegrass, which a lot of people use the crabgrass term for a lot of different things. Common groundsel, this plant is pretty high, and we'll see these later. Blessed milk, I brought a new mouse and everything, and it just keeps following me around. Blessed milk thistle, it's a lot like Italian thistle, but this is much shinier and doesn't have the hairs that the Italian thistle has. Spotted spurge, we'll talk a little bit more about the euphorbias later. And then, of course, dandelion, which everyone knows. So interesting thing about being a weed scientist is that, when we have something like this, it's like I tell people, I know it's a pigweed, and these are 3 different species of pigweeds, and I don't know which one it is. And you can see they all grow to be different, but they're all weedy. and we have to try and identify these weeds at a really small stage. And it's not really as important unless you're maybe growing amaranth as a crop, which some people do. You're going to have to know which one the weedy one is and which one the cultivated one is. So that's sometimes we lose a little bit of identification as a weed scientist because we want to get in and control them usually as soon as possible. So how do you make those identifications? Well, you can use keys. And here we have the Jepson manual, and I don't know how many of you have used this. If you're native plant people, get out and use this. I left my copy at work because I really like having this, especially for this video chats, because it really is a very impressive book to have behind your shoulder. People think you actually know how to use this. But the problem I have is that this is what you open. This is what you see when you open these books. Dichotomous keys are really hard to use unless you are a plant taxonomy expert. Because if you've never seen one of these or ever done a dichotomous key of any kind, you need to know exactly what each of these means, or you get stopped halfway up the page. So it really makes it tough. And the other thing you'll notice on this other page is that there are a lot of flower parts. So what else can we do? We use keys plus pictures. They're good if you know the family characteristics, and that's usually what I depend on are the flower characteristics. And we have this, and I don't know how many of you have this book or have seen this book. They're probably, I think right now they're $65 to $80 a copy, and they're a pretty large book. I have them. They're my biggest reference, and these are not 2 copies. These are the 2 volumes, and it's over 700 weeds, including seeds, seedlings, and mature plants. So it's really a good reference if you have one. Not everyone needs to have one, even though my good friend Joe would love to have everyone buy his book. Long as you have access to one, it really can be helpful. The other thing I want to say about this book real quickly is if you ever have a chance to look at one, and I do have one, we can maybe see it later, is that on the sides, the families are color coded. So when you look at these huge books of, oh my God, I can never be able to use that. If you look and see that the composites or the Asteraceae and the POA, the grass families, those comprise a large part of the books. So if you know it's not one of those, then you try to get down with the family, and it makes it really fairly easy for those of us that aren't taxonomists. So we can use an expert system, and this is one we're having, unfortunately, we've been having real problems with connecting to this at the Weed Research and Information Center because the Weed ID tool that we have, and I'll show you that here, is actually housed at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Mark Renz was Joe DiTomaso's graduate student, and they developed this. And then Dr. Renz took it to Wisconsin, and he's got the capacity up there to run this program. I saw Dr. Renz at a meeting about a month ago, the last meeting I actually went to, and he says they're working on it, but it's a conductivity we're having between the California site and the Wisconsin site. So hopefully we'll figure out some way to use this. We may just connect directly to the Wisconsin site. But the neat thing about this Weed ID tool is that you first to go in, you have to know if the plant is a broadleaf plant, a grass-like plant, or woody. Fairly easy. You don't have to know if it's a sedge or a rush or a grass. Long as it looks like a grass, you put in grass or broadleaf. And then you get a page like this, and this is what really makes this distinctively different than a dichotomous key, in that in these you only put in what you know. So here, where was the weed found? In an agricultural field or a natural and grazed area, a non-crop area, or an urban area. And when you hit that, they're all drop-down menus, which is nice. You don't have to fill them in. In an urban area, it would say something like, did you find it in your lawn? Did you find it in your garden? Did you, those. And then it has growth form. And the nice thing about these is the ones that are a little bit, excuse me, may need definition. You see the little question marks next to them. And that will show you pictures of what they actually look like. So you have a little more of an idea. Life cycle, sometimes you have to decide if it's an annual or a perennial, if it has perennial growth, which we'll talk more about later, will make it easier. Tendrils, like on a pea, pretty much easy, yes or no. Does it produce a milky sap? And then looking at the leaf arrangement, we're going to talk about all these. The thing is, though, is that, and I tell people, and I think people still take these, but it's like the SAT test. You never want to guess wrong, because in trying to find these weeds, you basically get 1 point for a right answer. You get no points for leaving it blank, and you get a negative point if you put in the wrong answer. Certain things like hairs. If you think that the plant has hairs and it doesn't, or in the most cases, you think it doesn't have hairs because you can't see them, and you put in no hairs, you probably will not find the weed that you want. So you really need to use, it's one of the few times looking for those little hairs that I tell people to use a hand lens to actually see these things. So, and then flower color. Oftentimes with weeds, we don't have a flower because we haven't wanted to wait that long to identify it, but you don't put them in. And the thing is when we hit search at the bottom there underneath, it'll come up and have, 7 or 8 or maybe 10 weed pictures. So is somebody barking a question? Do I hear that? No, is that Sorry. We have to have a little fun with these. I'm trying to make it as fun as possible. Anyway, so then it'll show you pictures at the bottom. And, even if you had 20 pictures, it's a whole lot easier going through 20 pictures than it is to go through a whole 2 volumes for this thing. So,
John, I have a question.
you betcha.
If you leave it, so my understanding is if you leave it blank, that's better than putting in the wrong information.
Right.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes. Leaving it blank is better than putting in the wrong information. Yes. So you don't want to guess. And the thing is that, you may come up, it's really disheartening when you put in, and it comes up with no weeds. And this is one for those of you who may know the little species of Carolina geranium or cutleaf geranium. It looks like a geranium. If I was there in person, we'd probably find one outside. And it doesn't look like it has any hairs, but if you turn it over and look on the bottom of the leaf, there are actually hairs. It is really embarrassing to be the weed science instructor and do it in a class and find no hairs and tell people that, or find no weeds. And so I use that as an example because, as most things, I learned by experience. The other thing too is if you've seen the little weed cards, and I'll show you some of these afterwards. I usually bring some with me. The nice thing is the book, the ID tool, and the little weed cards are all authored or co-authored by Dr. DiTomaso. And you can use those. What I tell people to do is if you get the little weed cards or even the book, find a weed that identify it there, then go through and do this with the weed ID tool. It's kind of a self-tutorial because in this case, it won't tell you what you got wrong. When you click on the weeds, so you use the book or use the little cards, and you can go back and see where you made a mistake. So while you learn with weeds, and the neat thing is that suggestion came from one of our master gardeners in Napa, who I've worked with quite a bit. So that, and it seems to work really well. So how do you identify weeds? So again, broadleaf weeds have wide leaves. The sedges have leaves in 3 sets. You need to have these triangular stems. The grasses, branching veins, narrow leaves, and we'll talk more and more about this. And a few of these slides I've incorporated from the UCIPM How to Identify Weeds website. And when you look at the pictures in there, myself and Cheryl Willen, our urban IPM advisor from Southern California, we sort of took all the weeds and put them in categories so it'd be easier for people to identify them. That's the good news. The bad news is Cheryl and I are both retiring this year. So hopefully we can keep this information out there. So this is one of my favorite old slides. You can see I took it from a slide, and really, and this is something that I stress to people quite a bit when they're looking at controlling weeds, no matter how you control them, with conventional herbicide, organic herbicide, hoeing, mowing, whatever you're going to do. One of the major differences is, and I'll ask this, remember this, because I'll ask this later when we're talking about control, the difference between grasses and most broadleaf plants. The big thing with grasses, especially, like a perennial grass, even annual grasses, the growing point for almost all grasses is at or below the soil level. Growing point for most broadleaf plants is up in the axis here. So it grows up. This is how come oftentimes you can mow your lawn or mow whatever you have out there in your yard, and the grasses will come back and the broadleaves won't. Now, there are some definite exceptions. Dandelion, which is why it's done so well in lawns over the centuries across the country, is because it grows from a basal rosette. But a lot of broadleaf weeds don't grow that way when you see them upright. So one of the major differences. So we'll first start out with broadleaf weed identification. And I always like to, tell people that these are weeds. They don't like rules. So does anybody have an idea of what this weed is? No. I'll keep moving. Now?
Saltgrass.
Okay, it's a broadleaf. Now? Almost everybody guesses Bermuda grass at this point, but it's not. It's this. It's Russian thistle, or tumbleweed. And I like to show this. This was taped by a friend of mine in Idaho, a weed scientist. It's the world's fastest weed. It was clocked at over 60 miles an hour. As he said, he was going 60 miles an hour down the road, and this weed blew past him. So the interesting thing about Russian thistle is that when it rolls, this is the way that it actually spreads the seed. Excuse me. I read an article one time. Maybe it was a UC publication that I was editing, and someone said, "Well, the tumbleweed or Russian thistle, the stem gets hard, and then when the wind comes, it blows it off. It blows and it breaks off and rolls down the road." And I was really upset. People don't give weeds enough credit. This plant, it doesn't that the crown gets hard. It's that it actually develops an abscission layer. So it cuts itself off so the wind can blow it down. And the interesting thing about the seeds with Russian thistle is that they are actually little embryos ready to just start. So it's not a seed that has to wait and then have dormancy and then maybe start to scratch through. Is that if it finds moisture, they'll germinate right away. Problem is with something like the shotgun approach is if it doesn't find moisture right away, or a little bit of moisture, and then that ephemeral water dies away or dries up, then the weed dies. But I went out, since I'm not able to take you out on a walk, I went out on a walk near my neighborhood. This is down, and I live on the edge of town. And I saw this big Russian thistle plant, the tumbleweed. And I think it's interesting that we just had the whole thing on the beets, being in the Chenopodium family. Well, if you look closely at these seed heads, you can see that this plant is also a Chenopodium. But this is what's, for me, very interesting is when you get next to this plant, you see all those little plants growing next to it. And unless going back to the slides that we had, this is all the seeds that are falling off of that plant. Now, a bunch of them probably fell on its way over there, but you can go back and see that there's just a huge amount, all those seed heads of this Russian thistle. So this is sort of in an open area near a fence, obviously. But it just, sometimes people, they'll ask me, "John, what's that green thing growing under that big dead plant?" Usually it's the same thing as the big dead plant. Nope. So the other thing is that we talked about the identification of weeds and the taxonomy. Boy, we might be here all day. I looked at my clock. Okay, so what taxonomists use for identification to get specifically down to that genus and species oftentimes are flower parts. This is what a weed scientist usually has. I tell people that while I am going to be retiring and still working with people with weeds, if I went out to one of my clientele, a grape grower, and they asked me what the weed was, and I said, well, I'm not sure. I'll come back when it's flowering. You know, I tell people that I wouldn't have my job very long, and I really, really like this job. It's just something we can't do half time, which is why I'll retire and be emeritus. But this is what we have. Usually a cotyledon, which are usually very distinctive, and also the first couple true leaves. After that, it gets really hard to control. So now the fairly dry part of the program, which I'll try to keep a little bit more interesting. Just the parts of the leaf. We have the blade, the petiole, the stipule, and then leaf type. A simple leaf, or different kinds of compound leaves. And here you can see some pictures. A trifoliate leaf, like clover, white clover in this case. Pinnate leaves, like artemisia or ragweed. And then this palmate leaf, or this cinquefoil. And you can see it looks like a palm, like the palm of your hand with fingers. Leaf arrangement. You have alternate leaves, whorled leaves, and you'll see a pretty good example of this one. Opposite leaves, and then of course our old friend dandelion in this basal rosette. Again, bedstraw with the whorled leaves. I know you've seen that, and I'll show you a couple other pictures of bedstraw. And then of course that basal rosette with dandelion. And as you can see, it doesn't grow up. The only thing that will come up is that flower stem, that hollow flower stem, which use that to identify from some other plants, and they come up very, very quickly. But you see the growing point is from that basal rosette. Chickweed. Now, when you look at a chickweed plant, these are opposite leaves. You can see the two, they're coming up at the same time, completely opposite of each other. Do plants have square stems? Again, the bedstraw, this one in the middle is henbit. Sometimes you'll see dead nettle, which is a little bit different color. Beautiful trumpets on this. If you roll that stem in your finger, you'll feel that it's square, and also something like horehound. So leaf shapes. Now, I'm not telling you that you need to identify all these leaf shapes, but just, and I tell people all the time, let the weed tell you what it is. And you've seen a lot of these. You'll see an orbicular leaf here pretty soon in some of my slides, a kidney-shaped leaf, or even an arrowhead-shaped leaf. A lot of some of our ornamental plants have an arrowhead-shaped leaf. Is it obovate or ovate, oblong? Just when you look at these, you know, I get so many questions about identifying a weed. People say, well, you know, it's little, it's green, it's got some leaves. Okay, can you help me out? Are they heart-shaped? And I go, I didn't notice. So it's just something to notice. Mustards with these kidney-shaped leaves. You know, and this is not all the plants. You know, people say, well, there are just a few. Are these the only ones? No, but it really gets you on the way to knowing what it is. This is my, excuse me, this is my favorite. The mallows, the family, the malvas, the cheeseweeds. And you can see the heart-shaped cotyledons. Very, very distinctive. And as I told you, there's an orbicular leaf on this one. The velvet leaf in the corner has that heart-shaped cotyledon. The leaves are not really orbicular, and those, you know, this is the weedy velvet leaf, but it's an abutilon. And I know some of you have maybe ornamental abutilons in your yard, same sort of thing. So this is one, I always ask people that, why do they call it cheeseweed? Anybody really quickly? Well, the answer is right here in front of you. The seed pod looks like a cheese wheel. So it doesn't taste like cheese or smell like cheese. And this is kind of a characteristic of the family. And you can see this, this abutilon, the velvet leaf. While it's not a cheese wheel, you can see those compartmentalized seed heads. So this, as we'll go on, this for me is one of the most important things is when you're identifying weeds, is to be able to really just get it down to a family. Leaf margins. Now, the nice thing about this is with the program that Joe has, excuse me, is you don't have to know if it's crenate or serrate or lobed or feathered. You just have to know, is it entire with no serrations whatsoever? Or does it have some serrations? So just entire or not, or toothed. So it makes it a little bit easier if you're doing that. Weeds like this, common groundsel, Senecio vulgaris. You see that even from a small stage up to the flowering adult, they have those identifying serrations in the leaves. Prickly lettuce. Now, it's interesting is that this is one of the reasons I think that Joe went to the entire or not. Now, this is, sometimes you'll see both these leaves on the same plant, not all the time. Oftentimes it's a different biotype, but you can see that there are serrations on the one on your right and deep lobes on the one on your left. Same plant. Interesting about prickly lettuce is that, and you see a lot of this now, seems to be a lot of prickly lettuce and also sow thistle outgrowing, 4 or 5 feet tall on the sides of the highways. But the interesting thing about prickly lettuce is that this is how we identify it. The other thing too is that it does have some milky sap. You can see the genus Lactuca, and then you can see here these prickly lettuce, these spines, and this is not a huge plant. You can see me holding the leaf on your left side. On the right side here, you can see that the prickles running down the mid vein, and that's how we usually identify prickly lettuce. Milky sap. So again, we talked before. Anybody know what family this is?
Euphorbia?
Very good, Jeff. Yes, euphorbia. And a lot of you have these ornamental euphorbias at home. Really kind of nondescript flowers or seeds. But when you break it open, we do get this milky sap. And be careful, it is a latex sap, different than some of the other milky saps. Some people are actually can get dermatitis from this. But this, again, like the spotted spurge we had, this is called petty spurge. But again, in that same family, be able to look just in that one group of if you went to the books. So a little bit on grass identification. And I love to read this part. You can probably all read it here since it's here, but I'll do this. The leaf is composed of the sheath and the blade. The sheath encloses the stem and is connected to the blade at the junction. You can also use this if you have to be fitted for a respirator. It's one of those tests like you have when you're reading in a doctor's office. Found by the collar. The collar is located on the outer side of the leaf, and the ligule is located on the inner side of the leaf. The auricles, or ears, are the appendages projecting around the stem from both sides of the collar. Joints in the stem are called nodes. The part between any two nodes is called the internode. I think most people know that one. So before I go on, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands since I really can't see it, or you don't have to tell me. But I know a lot of you are dog owners. And it's really important, oftentimes, especially with the grasses, the dogs will get the seed heads caught in their fur, in their ear, in their eyes, and their nose. And people always complain usually about foxtail. So the one thing is that, if you have, if you're on the side of a hill, which I know some people are in Marin and Sonoma and Napa, and if you've had a fire and you want to have something, or it's just you don't want to leave your area just blank because of erosion and just not having it complete open space, we want to keep some grasses. But if you have animals, dogs, or even farm animals, sheep and goats, you don't want every grass to come back in the same percentage. Sometimes we want to favor one over the other by hoeing it out or pulling or whatever we do. But it's important at a very young age to know what those grasses are. How do we do that? And this is how I've tried to show the importance of being able to identify grasses before they go to seed to people who are pet or farm animal owners. So we start with these pencil drawings of the ligule behind the back of in front of the blade, the auricles in the front, and then the leaf blade itself. And you can see here, these are the auricles that wrap, in this case, wrap around the plant. Not in all cases. Again, a close-up. Now here we have the 3 plants. Oats, wheat and barley. Now these are obviously cereals, but we do have some examples in the weed world, which I'll show you. But you can see if you're looking at the auricles wrapping around the front, on the right is the barley, the way they wrap completely around the front. In the wheat, they're short, and then on the oats, there really are none. So I usually do this, an example, and I don't know if you can see me. Well, I'm not going to stand up, but what I usually do when I show this to the class is that I stand with my hands behind my back to show the oats, my hands at my side to show the wheat, and then wrapping around the front to show the barley. Let me see. Oh, I lost the chat. I don't know if someone had a question for me. Okay. Anyway,
Where
yes.
where are the collars located on these three examples?
That the collar is right here. That is the collar.
Thank you.
Right at this point. I'm sorry. Thank you. I'll have to figure out how to see the chat later when I guess I'm not sharing. So yeah, and we'll right at this point. So this is all the region we're looking at right here. So if you look at the plant, you can see where well, I'll show you on some others as we go on. But good question. And stop me for something like that for sure. Okay, so when you pull out, you see the collar region. Now we see the ligule on the back. On the oats on your left, the wheat in the middle, and the barley on the right. You can see the ligules in the back are different, and then you can see a close-up of the auricles. Oats not having any, wheat having some, and then the barley having those wrapping auricles. Now, you know, there are thousands and thousands of grasses, and they're all going to have a little bit different here or there, but this is just a way to try and identify that. And I'm going to show you a few of our local weeds that have some of these characteristics. So one of the weeds that I think is very, very important for you to maybe not have if you have animals is this ripgut brome. So the interesting thing about ripgut brome and oats is that you see that neither one has ligules. I'm sorry, neither one has auricles wrapping around the front, and they both have this long papery ligule in the back. The oats up in the top left corner, the ripgut brome in the bottom right corner, and you can see if you look at the blade of the ripgut brome, you will see these stiff hairs that I have here on the slide. Where oats are not completely hairless or glabrous, but they have very, very few hairs, and they lack these stiff hairs along the leaf. Or you can see here on this plant where they are. So just some close-up pictures on my walk that I took. You can see that I'm digging them out with my fingers. You can see the dirt under my fingernails here as I'm taking these pictures. Here is foxtail. So foxtail barley, hordeum, and it has the same sort of auricles as our domestic barley does. You can see them right here. Now the thing about these is that as these plants get older and become a little bit dry, these are very thin. They'll dry up very quickly. But by then, you'll have the seed head to identify. You can see them here, the two plants together. You can see exactly where the collar region is right here. But they will start to dry up later. This is ripgut brome. And the interesting thing about this is that I really can't show you what makes this weed so bad. It's actually fairly pretty. It's kind of soft. It's got this nice brome head. But this is one that you do not want if you have dogs. These seed heads, and you'll see as we hold it, my fingers holding it on the left side here, these long awns off the seed head going all the way out to the right. These, if you were to hold the other tip on the awns, you could not move your finger backwards. There are little stiff hairs, and if you get a chance, be very careful. But if you get a chance to see one of these growing, and you'll see quite a bit of it now, just try and do that. What happens with these, and these are, they're probably, 3 inches long, maybe longer, is that this will get into the dog's nose or ears, and it goes in and it won't come out. So you can't pull it out. So you'll have to go to the veterinarian or something, or really, if you can, with intensely, but it just keeps moving, just like sort of the way the teeth on a snake are backwards, where something goes in, it can't come out. So this is one we don't want. Here's the wild oats on the other hand, and you've probably seen these growing. I think these are the wild oats. There's also one that's much thinner called slender oats, and you can see it's got that no auricles here as opposed to what we have with the foxtail barley, and it has this long papery ligule in the back. This is one you would want to keep. Ryegrass. Ryegrass has very distinctive head, and while I don't really show the collar region here, with ryegrass, and this is what you see here with this big blessed milk thistle growing in the middle, is this very shiny cover to it. It's you can see, just if you see grasses growing in a big patch like this, it's almost probably 90% that it's going to be ryegrass, and then they usually have some seed heads. This one germinates pretty early in the season, so we have a lot of seed heads by now. So we have to start looking at now perennial grasses with a blade and rhizome and stolons. Now this is what I just had a question about this from a Napa master gardener the other day. He bought some Kentucky bluegrass sod in a small place for his yard, and he also has annual bluegrass growing in it as a weed. It shouldn't have come in as a contaminant, but it did. The thing about the perennial bluegrass is that it does have some rhizomes, so it can kind of fill in where the annual bluegrass as an annual plant won't. So Johnson grass. Johnson grass isn't a huge problem on the coast. It's coming in more and more into Napa. Some of you may know I don't live in Napa. I live more near Davis in Woodland, and this has been a weed here in agricultural fields here for years. But it's on my drive-in, when I used to drive in, this is starting to grow just on the edge of town. Like I tell people, I won't testify to it in court, but I think the seeds from Johnson grass came in from some of the wattles, the things with the straw in them to hold the erosion back for wet areas. But there's a lot of Johnson grass in some areas where about 3 or 4 years ago I saw the wattles growing, or wattles being set. So the interesting thing about it, and I'll show you, here's that you see these rhizomes. They look like crab legs. And one thing you'll notice is that at every joint, if you can look, there are roots already happening. So the worst thing you could do with this plant would be to try and rototill it and spread those rhizomes everywhere. So this is Johnson grass coming back very early in the season. I took these pictures a couple weeks ago, and you can see it's just coming out from those rhizomes coming back. And here's when I just broke one off. I didn't have really a shovel, but you can see nice and healthy, starting to grow, and this thing will just start to spread out. Real problem, perennial weed. So biology, we'll go, it's about 5 minutes to 10. I don't know if we want to take just a couple minute break before I get into biology, or we want to go ahead. Anybody?
Whatever you want to do, John.
Why don't we just, before I get into biology, why don't we just take come back in at, what time is it now?
5 to 10.
5 to 10. Why don't we just come back in at 10 o'clock? That way people can get a cup of coffee or take a break or whatever, and then we'll come back in right at 10 o'clock.
Sounds good.
All right. Sounds good. Okay, are we ready to start back again?
I think so.
Okay, I think I've got them all set. Everything's getting kind of, let me go back. All right, so I've actually I was able to bring my chat screen up during the break. So now if you have a question you want to send out, I can actually be able to read them a little better than I did before. So, oh, I got the back of my, there we go. All right. So we're back now. I realize I'm going to have to probably go a little bit quicker and not tell quite so many stories. As I said before, I think in the early, I tend to, when I can't get to see people's reactions, I just tend to try and fill in. So I'll try and go a little bit faster. So, all right, starting with weed biology. You know, when you can, especially with annual weeds, it's really important for us to control them as early as possible. So we want to get in and right after, especially right after they sprout, get in before they grow to seed. Really, really, really important when it comes to these annual weeds. So on my walk, I took this picture, and this is fleabane, which some of you may know. Fleabane or the mare's tail or horseweed. These are Caniza or Erigeron genus now that I think the geneticists have changed it to. But you see these growing everywhere. And the thing about this is that, you know, again, this is a sort of an open area, but you see these periodically. But this is what all that turns into. And it's just amazing. I've never really seen this kind of a weed population. It's just was, you know, for me, intriguing. I know for other people, it just looks like plants. But it really is something very interesting to see for me, all this germination, just with the perfect conditions that we've kind of had warm weather and then moisture off and on. Now with perennial weeds, it's really interesting, and this, and I know people have differing views on their use of herbicides, but in this case with perennials, it's very interesting, and I've told people for years that, you know, oftentimes herbicides are overused, but there are a few perennials that that are the reason that they can be used. And this is something that's interesting. Either one, when you're working with perennial weeds, you can see how quickly, just like that Johnson grass, how quickly it becomes perennialized. So you really need to get out early. If you were using a systemic herbicide, you may have to wait, if you can't get in there early, until after the plants have actually gone to flower. Just like any other perennial plant, like your fruit trees or grapes, you know, they send the sugars down into the roots just before going dormant after flowering, basically, or after fruiting. So that's the same sort of thing when it comes to perennials. But you really do need to get them out fairly early. Some plants become perennialized very quickly. Others, it does take a little while for them to do that. But once they start having this kind of growth, they have become perennial, and this will then start to sprout out again. So simple perennial weeds, they reproduce primarily from seed. They don't reproduce from roots or rhizomes. They can reproduce from root segments if the root is cut or broken off. And of course, those are looking at and some people consider some of these medicinal herbs, but they can be controlled fairly easily by digging them out. Of course, dandelion, curly dock, and some of the other docks, sheep sorrel and nose, and then the plantains, buckhorn plantain and broadleaf plantain. And we'll talk, I think, a little bit more about the dandelions when we get to control. Now, creeping perennials are the worst weeds. In cases where I've talked to school districts and cities about reducing their herbicide use, you know, they can do this, but there are certain times of really pinpoint applications to try and kill some of these weeds, because they really can spread, and they're in a different class by themselves. The Johnson grass and Bermuda grass, creeping perennials, Johnson grass, primarily with the rhizomes, and then produces a lot of seeds. Bermuda grass has both these above ground stolons and rhizomes. Field bindweed, and I know this weed can be a huge problem. It really is. I think they have it really is. This top part, this biomass here, is pretty much just the tip of the iceberg. And I don't have, someone's asked me for data, but you know, from what we've seen and just observationally, you know, this much is probably on a dry weight biomass is probably maybe 30% or 25% of the biomass of this plant. Almost all of it is below ground with rhizomes and stolons. It's just amazing. The interesting thing about bindweed, which really is amazing to me, is this field probably got this way by someone just disking or taking, and I'll talk about disking later, but just cultivating the top over and over and over and getting rid of all the competition. which really has no effect on a plant that, in my case, where I live in Yolo County, these rhizomes can be down 8 to 10 feet. So creeping roots. So they're just scratching the top and you're killing all the competition. It gets all the water. So it's just done very well. The interesting thing about bindweed too, well, interesting to me, is that the seeds last 15 to 20 years also. So this plant is just continually reproducing itself. Nutsedge, you know, it's a creeping, and you see these little nutlets. The seeds that you, or the flowers you see on a annual nutsedge plant really have almost no viability. So you don't really have to worry about the seeds of nutsedge, just those rhizomes. We're lucky here that with yellow nutsedge in the northern part of the state, if you do get nutsedge in certain areas in Marin, probably the warmer areas, these nutlets are on the end of these roots. With purple nutsedge, which grows in the San Joaquin Valley, they grow in a line. So this one you could actually even pull off the top, have this one sprout, and then kill it again, be able to get it. The purple nutsedge, if you can imagine here, that from here, if you can see my arrow, there'll be one here, and then another little line and another nutlet here, and a line here and another nutlet here, that when this one starts to grow, this one starts to spread out and send another nutlet. So it's just it's probably in the top 5 of world's worst weeds. Of course, you all know about pest notes. They're a great resource. We released the dandelions one that I redid, and I'm actually editing a few more now. You know, the life cycle and the impact, those have not changed. The identification, those are good. We're updating some of the control methods. So here I want to talk about some weeds that go into a little bit more depth on some of these weeds that you have in your garden. And again, if you have a question, hit me with the chat. Annual bluegrass, you know, cool season, annual, biennial, perennial. Probably some of you who live closer to the coast in Marin, the annual bluegrass may stay green most of the year. Annuals die and perennial types go dormant under hot conditions. Seeds have been reported to survive 30 years under field conditions, and some can survive in cattle. I just like to add these little things once in a while. But you know this, the annual bluegrass here. Real quick, there's a question about, is a weed just someplace where it doesn't, where you don't want it? You leave dandelions for bees and beneficial insects. You know, the thing is, though, is that there are, the problem with weeds is that they have a tendency to be weedy. Leaving a dandelion to go for the bees is good now, but you may end up having more than you want. If that land is specifically just for bee habitat, that's fine. But you may at some point, the dandelions will compete with your annual crops. There are other plants that you can grow that we know the life cycle of, that make it easier to control when and if you need to. So they do have the purpose. We have some weeds that are actually that we use as cover crops. People say, can you use weeds as cover crops? Well, by definition, if you use it as a cover crop, it's no longer a weed, but you've known how to manage it. But we do have that. Down in the San Diego area, we have Arundo donax, and some of you may know Arundo. It's a huge bamboo-like grass. Well, it basically changes its entire environment. It changes everything about it. It's huge. It grows to be 10 feet, but now it's become habitat for some endangered birds, which is great for the birds, but not so great for everything else that used to grow there. So it's, and I do have a whole nother slide set that I'm not showing today, but about the certain characteristics that make weeds weeds. The fact that they don't have a specialized, they don't have a specialized pollinator, or they go to seed at pretty early stages, or they're able to spread and they're hard to get to. So there are some weeds that are just by definition weeds. Others, sometimes it is just growing out of place. But others, they're just, you can never, you can never control these weeds, I guess, the way you want them. So the definition, exactly is a definition of a weed. It really, I mean, it really is like they say, people that you, a plant you don't want, but there are some weeds that are definitely specifically are going to be weedy. Some of them are here because of what we do. You know, they do like different conditions. One of the things that we have, even like in California, where the climate has, you know, changed over the years, you know, we used to have a lot of perennial grasses, and now we have annual grasses. Some of the grasses that you see now, all these wild oats, rye, and all those are all European invasive grasses, and they do better under drought conditions. They may never have been here had we not introduced them from Europe, but the fact that they're much more suited for this changing climate than our native perennials are. You can say that maybe with fire, if we would allow the fires to go and the deer to populate, that we wouldn't have these annual grasses. So it's really, but they are a good feed source. So it's really hard to say a real exact definition of a weed. So that's, but there are some characteristics that make them weed. Okay, well that was a long, as I tell people, you may have short questions, but I have no short answers, unfortunately. Annual bluegrass, and it's just, there's some really neat things about annual bluegrass. It's if you live in a very cool area, it will stay green quite a while. Here in Sacramento Valley, it's starting to dry out, and when it dies, it leaves holes for other for weeds to come in. But it's a prolific seeder. The interesting thing is this characteristic right here, the bow of a boat, is what the leaf looks. It's very a characteristic of a lot of the POA genus. Dandelions, you know, each plant can produce thousands of seeds, and seeds can germinate all year. Excuse me. You know, when you have something like this dandelion is going to be taking over everything. Yes, it may be the flowers are wonderful, and the bees do love the dandelion flowers, but it can spread just outrageously, and it may not be what you want. Especially for someone like me, I have a love-hate relationship with bees. I actually carry an EpiPen, and we'll talk more about that later. You know, I enjoy honey too. So this is those of you who have a dandelion fork or a dandelion knife. This is why we have to have them. You see here what someone took, a researcher took a dandelion plant and dug it out, I don't know, down about a foot, and then just cut the parts of the root and exposed them to light, and you can see all those pieces germinated. So if you dig out pull out a dandelion and don't do anything, it will resprout. You need to use that dandelion fork or dandelion knife, dig it out, and then bury it so they don't get sun. So if you can't dig all of it out, or will come back. Common groundsel. This one's interesting. It's a winter annual that germinates in the fall. Fairly early, produces up to 25,000 seeds per plant. The seeds usually only last 1 year, and you'll see later when I talk about how long some of these seeds last, it can last in a dry area for much longer than that, but not the seed coat isn't hard, so it's attacked by a lot of microorganisms in the soil. You can see it here. You know, what's interesting is I had a grape grower one time who had groundsel growing in the vineyard, and he said, John, what do I do to control the groundsel? And I said, well, why do you want to control the groundsel? That's pretty much all you have. And I said, it's going to die out very soon. It doesn't grow thick. It's an annual. It's, you know, the seeds don't last long. If that's the only weed problem you have, you know, you cultivate once or twice, or just don't worry about it. It's not a problem. The interesting thing about groundsel, if you have groundsel growing in your backyard, or not backyard so much, but in a area where you have maybe farm animals, is groundsel, every part of the groundsel plant is poisonous, but it is a liver poison. So it's not like you just take one bite. It is something that needs to accumulate. And if most animals, goats, sheep, and those, if they have other things to eat, they won't eat groundsel. When it becomes a problem is that when you only have groundsel growing in an area, that can be a problem. So yes, I see here someone said that the dandelion leaves are delicious in salads. Yes, they are. But you don't really want the plant going to seed all the time because you'll have a lot of salad. But I think keeping it controlled, and you may only have salad is what I mean. Is that by keeping it not going to seed all the time, you'll have actually a much better salad. Oh, someone says, what is a dandelion fork? I think you all, it's the long, you see them in the garden stores. They have a little fork at the bottom. It's just a little like a long stick that's sharp at the bottom. Is that anybody else? Is that a good definition of a dandelion fork? Yeah, I think that's it. And you'll see here the groundsel, the different kinds of seeds. And this, you see this in a lot of our composite plants, is that they have the seeds with that'll drop just straight to the ground, and those that'll fly away, because I seem to make it sound like weeds think. They don't really think. But here it's like, well, this place is good to have a plant because I grow. So we drop some seeds here. This is a good spot. We also want to expand out, which is why we have the seeds that can fly to expand to new areas. Oxalis, 2 species of Oxalis, both are perennial. One spreads by seed. So this is the creeping wood sorrel one we usually just call Oxalis. Spreads by seed up to 5,000 per plant. Can be expelled up to 8 feet. I love that one. Light is required for germination. So when it comes to being a master gardener, I tell people that all the master gardeners have to take a mulch pledge, that you will mulch everywhere and anywhere you can. And one of the things about wood sorrel is that mulch works because it needs light. Now, it also will grow on top of if it does get up and grows on top of the mulch, and it spreads those seeds everywhere. But it's fairly easy. If it gets too thick, like it did at my house, I just tell people that I planted it. The whole plant must be pulled. Severed stems can develop new plants. And this is the thing about weeds that really start to get out of control. Control before seeds are produced. Seedlings flower in as little as 4 weeks, nearly year-round. So that means in a month it goes from seedling to seed. And you all know the Oxalis, and the seed heads here look like an okra, I guess, and they dry out, and the seeds can actually be spit out everywhere. Bermuda buttercup is the other one, and some people sourgrass. It's interesting because this one goes dormant in the summertime, not in the wintertime. And I took this down the block at my neighbor's house. This is a really interesting weed. People think that it's really pretty, and it is that first year. The second year, it spreads, and you didn't have to plant it. And by the third year, you realize that it's taken over your entire yard. It's got the bulblets here. This is Pigeon Point down in the Central Coast, and this is all Bermuda buttercup, or Oxalis pescapri. You can see it spreads by these bulblets, and this really stiff stem. Really, the weed is really hard to control chemically at all. It really needs, the best we have at the university is tell people to dig it out before it spreads. The problem is it really looks pretty that first year, and then before you know it, 4 or 5 years down the road, it's really taken over the entire neighborhood. If you've ever been to Davis, between the UC Davis campus and where Central Park is, where the big farmers market is, that entire neighborhood is just overrun by Oxalis. Bermuda grass. I think we all know Bermuda grass. So this is the thing. Most people will call this crabgrass. This is not crabgrass. Bermuda grass is a perennial. Crabgrass is an annual. In a lot of places in California, we won't see much crabgrass. And if you were to see crabgrass, even in my area here where it warms up, we see crabgrass probably not germinating until maybe the middle of this month, and it's an annual. You see some crabgrass in your garden, which is a large crabgrass, but the problem is in some people like to use weed and feeds, which I'm not a huge proponent of weed and feeds. I'd rather fertilize and kill instead of trying to do both at the same time. But the problem is if you were to buy, someone were to buy weed and feed for crabgrass, not only would it not kill the Bermuda grass, it would help it grow because it's not an annual. So really making sure that people know the difference between crabgrass and Bermuda grass and Dallas grass is very, very important. Dallas grass, another perennial. Creeping and spotted spurge, you know, they can produce seeds within 2 weeks. So twice as fast as the Oxalis. Light burial can dramatically reduce germination. Again, mulch for spurge, and if they come through, pull them out. So they have the two different spurges, the spotted spurge and the creeping spurge. Working in container ornamental research years ago, I think we saw some of the first creeping spurge coming in from other areas outside of California. And this is the one that if it's growing in your yard, it holds onto the rocks, where the spotted spurge kind of grows just flat. Yellow nut sedge does not move by seed. Tubers will develop in 2 to 3 weeks. You can, this is one that you really can keep pulling. Oh, so I have noticed a lot of ant activity around spurges when I'm digging it out at home. Very good. Ants have been known to spread the seeds. So they use these seeds. Very good, Jeff. They spurge. The ants use spurge seeds as a food source. So what's interesting is in working in some of the larger orchards in, and I want to show you the plant one more time. Oh, no, that's the wrong one. So in working some of the large orchards in the Central Valley, they're really concerned about spurge. Spotted spurge is tiny little weed growing in their huge tree orchards, almond orchards, those sorts of things. And I couldn't figure out why. Why would you be concerned about spurge? Well, one of the reasons is, and this just amazed me, is the ants are always looking to store the spurge seeds. Well, they find that sprinkler heads with those little holes in them are a perfect place to store their spurge seeds, and they actually block the sprinkler heads from working. So it really is the little ant that could. I mean, it brings down a whole orchard by doing this. Also, you know, having any sort of ant populations when it comes to aphids and protecting them is very important too. So they are a big seed source. And Jeff, thank you for pointing that out. That's it's just amazing. Some of these little things that happen. Spurge is not a huge weed by any means, and it seems like it's not very competitive, but it becomes a seed source for ants. And that is integrated pest management, as I like to tell people, really looking at how we change a lot of other things. You know, nut sedge, and I took this picture of the bottom right corner of my neighbor's house across the street, finding a spot near the moisture. This is growing in a Bermuda grass lawn too, but it's an open area that they kind of keep weed-eated back so they can have, don't have to worry about it edging. So you do see a lot of sedges that aren't a nut sedge, a lot of ornamental sedges. And you notice the seed head is different. So not all, it's perennial, but it doesn't have the nutlets. So you do see a lot of native sedges and sedges just growing around ponds and areas. So just some other weeds I want to talk about real quickly. Panicle willow herb, we see a lot of this around. This really is just can become a huge problem. See a lot of it now. It germinates in the fall and grows through the wintertime. People used in the past have used Roundup on it, and it's one of these weeds when people say that it killed everything. It doesn't. This willow herb was completely naturally tolerant. You can see what's happened. It's very interesting. It breaks the apical dominance in the plant by killing the top, but then every little lateral bud grew. Very interesting. They all look like they were mowed. And this is what happened too. We saw this in a lot of open areas where it was sprayed. Kind of looked like it was dead, but then it would all come back. Horseweed or caniza, and also fleabane, huge weed producers. See a lot of this, and again, I showed you that seed head, and they seem to be flying everywhere now. It's very drought tolerant. It's supposed to be a summer annual, but in our climate, especially up in the North Coast, it doesn't get cold enough to kill it, so it pretty much grows all year round. Ryegrass. Ryegrass is a very interesting weed. Very, very competitive. I have a question here. Is it true that weeds evolved to resist Roundup after just a few generations? Not all weeds, but this one, ryegrass. Ryegrass. I tell people now, when we're all gone and just a memory, that it'll be cockroaches climbing on ryegrass. Ryegrass is an amazing. If you plant ryegrass as a turf for a baseball field and mix it with other grasses, several years down the road, it'll only be ryegrass. It's not a lilopathy or using its own chemicals. It's just very, very competitive. It's become resistant to, and I'll show you the next slide, to all kinds of chemical sprays. It's very adaptive. It's I think I have it here. No, I have. It's an obligate outcrosser. So if you know what that means, is that this plant, this ryegrass plant, or this head cannot be pollinated by the same plant. It has to be pollinated by another plant. So if one plant has a gene, it goes to this one. This ryegrass is can be used as a lot of things, a cover crop, and a lot of things, but it has the genetic capability of becoming a weed very, very quickly, without chemicals or with chemicals. It's just an amazing plant. It's amazing how much in awe I am of ryegrass. I know not everybody else is, but this is interesting. I was called to a vineyard where they knew that almost all the ryegrass is completely resistant to glyphosate use, because of being overused and on the highways and those sorts of things. And the grower knew this, so he used something else. And when we see something like this, we know when you see some dead plants, some semi-dead plants, and some live plants, that it's probably not a misapplication, that something actually is resistant. Oh, anyway, so it's just an amazing plant. Stinkwort. Now this is something I know it's a huge problem in Marin. And it really became that way fairly short period of time for weeds. Well, first, I think it was first supposed to be reported. That's the first time I've actually looked at this slide. Is this why Roundup was found in most California wines? Well, we can cover that later when I talk about it. It wasn't. I mean, it was found at very, very low rates, and it's because a lot of people. This is why was Roundup found in most. It wasn't found in most California wines, but it is used in a lot of different areas at fairly low rates. But yeah, it was. There's a lot of reasons for that, and we can talk about why so many people used Roundup in it. But anyway, we'll move on from that for now. Stinkwort. It's native to the Mediterranean region, first reported in Alameda in 1995, so not that long ago. Unpalatable to livestock. And I think you may have seen it if you've been in southern Marin. It really spread faster than any weed we've ever seen. Let me see, I have a question here. Does any or all clover fix nitrogen? Wood sorrel and spurge kind of look like clover. Are they beneficial as nitrogen fixers? No, they're not. They're not related at all to legumes. So moving on, you see the flowers produce seeds like crazy. This is a field near my house. Goats won't eat it. Goats actually can't eat it because of there's little hairs on it that actually rip holes in their stomach. So they will leave, and you know, goats pretty much, they say they eat everything. They do almost eat everything, but they will leave the stinkwort. The biggest problem we have is that it looks a lot like the Russian thistle, but it's not. And this can cause dermatitis. It's just spread everywhere. It germinates late in the season. So it really has become a huge problem. It's after people are doing barely any kind of weed control, chemical or non-chemical, late in the season, and it just really has found an open space to spread. You see here where everything else has been eaten or is dead, the stinkwort is still nice and green and going to seed. It flowers in December, which is so different from most of our other plants. Sharp point fluvelin. This is one that has really, it's been around a long, long time. It's just really become more prevalent. It moved in some of our floods years ago, in like 2006, and it's just everywhere now. A lot of people see different forms, but it grows just into this huge mat, about 6 feet, and is very, very competitive. This is a small grapevine that is going to die if we don't do something about the fluvelin. Just an amazing, amazing plant again. So this is something that I like to show people. This was an experiment that I did just tracking the fluvelin, and you can see that this was in a vineyard in an area where it wasn't controlled. And the first year, these little black marks are where the fluvelin is. These rows are about 20 rows apart. It's a replication of another trial. So every place you see a black mark is where I found a fluvelin looking every 6 inches in this transect. Here's the same row, year 2, you can see how it spread, and then finally year 3. So I tell people that, you know, and this is in a vineyard, but this is the same thing in your garden or any other place. If you see a weed, and you know it's a weed, and you know it has the capability of moving like fluvelin does, you need to get in and dig it out here, control it somehow here, because if you don't, it will continue to spread. So this is when I talk to the grape growers about having a monitoring program, and a lot of people say, yeah, we monitor our weeds. I said, well, what do you do with that data? You need to use it. You need to at any time, you need to go in and know it's time to go in and kill those weeds. I mean, look what's happened here. This row is almost entirely fluvelin now. After 3 years, this row that didn't have it is now as bad as that first year, which means it's going to spread throughout the vineyard from there on. And you can see it's become a huge problem even after it dies. Okay, so that's the end of the biology section. We've been in about an hour and 15. I have about. We're going to go into I think the fun part now. That for me is stuff that I think needs to be taught, but is fun. So. Is fluvelin, I got a few, we'll have a few questions before we move on. Let me take a drink here real quick. Is fluvelin controlled by pulling? Yes, it is an annual. The problem is that you have to pull it early because the seeds do last 20 years. How do I feel about Bermuda grass as a lawn? I'm fine. My wife hates it. But there are some, in fact, if you want to put in a Bermuda grass lawn, there are some new hybrid Bermudas that aren't nearly as nasty and spread like our old Bermuda grass, and especially maybe where you are, it's a lot more, I don't know how cold it gets in some of the areas, but it's a lot more cold tolerant. So it's good. And then it will, you know, you water it a little bit, but it's pretty drought tolerant. It just, we have problems with it in some of the areas because it does get so cold here, but they are making it more cold tolerant. Would a deep layer of mulch or cover crop between the vineyard rows help to manage weeds? So we do have, I mean, almost every vineyard in the North Coast has cover crops. We keep the cover crop away from the vines themselves because of, mostly because of voles. And we'll talk a little bit about that later with, if you know the little field mice, they can girdle the vines and actually kill them, because no matter how big or how old a grapevine is, the cambium layer, which is the actual growing layer that's that's the growing part of the vine, is very, very small. So that's why a lot of it, and also water use. Having any cover crop growing during the summertime will use water, and we do have to irrigate some of the grapes. Let me see. Are Are any of these annual weeds ever used as a cover crop where it is somewhat manageable? We use burr clover and some other annual grasses. Problem with something like annual bluegrass, if there are some areas on the Silverado Trail in Napa where annual bluegrass and chickweed are a really nice cover crop, and they've been able to manage that over the years. But oftentimes, when they dry out, something else comes in. So, does Doc have a long yellow carrot-like root? Carrot-like root. Can, but I'm not exactly sure what that is. Okay, I think my yard is covered in fumitory. What? I don't know what that would be. You want to hold up a weed sample? You're gonna have to. Let me see if I can make that one bigger. I don't. Oh, yeah. I don't think I know that one. Can you move it just a little bit more to your left? Yeah. No, I don't. Unfortunately, I don't think I know that one. I'm sorry. But you have a weed ID tool to try and figure out what it is. So, what do we have? Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It seems that weeds will grow wherever bare soil is exposed to direct radiation. A weed's main purpose to prevent soil being radiated by the sun and erosion. Is a weed's main purpose to prevent soil being radiated by the... No, a weed's main purpose is just to grow. I think they can, any place, and we'll talk about this later on when we talk about control methods. Anytime there's available water and nutrients, nature abhors a vacuum. So if there's a spot for it, it'll fill it in. So what weeds are edible? A lot, and some are deadly. I tell people this, it's like eating mushrooms. You go out, you better know what the heck you're doing. So, and I had somebody one time call me and say they described a weed to me. And by the time we were done, the person said, "So is that weed edible?" And I said, "Well, if you've described it to me the way exactly what it is, and I've been able to decipher exactly what you said, that weed, yes, is edible." And she goes, "Well, if it's close, it should be good." And I said, "Yeah, like mushrooms." She said, "No, they're not like that." I said, "Exactly." So unless you know enough about it, I've been eating miner's lettuce salad all week. Yeah, there are some that are good. Yeah. There are, but as long as you know what weeds you're eating and where you're getting them from, that's always very important. Does solarization kill most weeds? We'll talk about solarization later when we get to control. But yeah, you really need to, just like someone who goes out and collects mushrooms, you really need to know what you're pulling. All right, why don't I go ahead? We'll definitely talk about solarization when we get to control here in the next section. This is the fun section for me, is talking about control. Okay. Yeah, Native American guidebooks are great for edible weed identification. Yeah, for me, and Dr. DiTomaso was really great at edible weeds, and there are some really good books on edible weeds. But and I deal with lots of large growers, and if I were to tell someone who was farming 1,000 acres to go eat their weeds, they may not like the answer. So I have a wide, broad base of clientele. So I'm not an expert in what's edible. So I leave that to the experts. Just like entomology, I don't know anything about bugs either. So all right. Okay, so this is the fun part, and this is all really what we want to know: which weeds to control, which ones not to control, and I think this will answer some of your questions about weeds earlier. And I always tell people this: I've told every person I've ever worked with, every weed can be controlled by hand. All it takes is time and money. And I said sometimes in some of these weeds, you may have to have a chainsaw in that hand, but it's not like diseases or insects where, you really, you need to know, maybe with a disease, sometimes you need to act before they get there. There's not a weed that can't be controlled in some sort of a hand mechanism. It's just that, right now, there's less than 1% of the people in America are farmers, and we have a lot fewer people doing the farming. As I tell people, a lot of people don't want to go back into farming because even at UC Davis, where it doesn't pay like Google does, and it's really hard work. Those are the people who are out there now providing food for us, but not everybody seems to want to do it. So this is the question I get a lot, and this is the question that I don't think people often ask. And for me, this has probably been the biggest thing about the whole glyphosate Roundup controversy, is that people are actually thinking about weeds again. They never really have. And I think a lot of this is it's been a great opportunity for me to actually, people have asked for my advice more than ever before, which is good, because I was around before glyphosate, and I understand that what we're doing and how we've had to use biology and ID. But competition, why control weeds? Competition, and you know this. If you have especially a winter garden and you've planted carrots or broccoli or some of these things, you know that if you don't control your weeds, you're not going to have a crop. You can see here that they're doing the best they can to get in and control these weeds. Some of them are edible, some of them are not. This one looks like a lot of chickweed in there. You're going to have to do a lot of work to get a very little crop in there. Or very little, if you're going to eat the chickweed. And the grasses, you're not going to want to eat foxtail. But you can see here that they actually, looks like they may even have one big dandelion plant that they've down here in the corner that they've maybe left. Maybe it is, or maybe it's Swiss chard. But you can see here that why you're controlling these weeds. Aesthetics. Now I tell people, I can't, especially if you're selling your house. And I make the joke about the North Coast, that every place else in the country except the North Coast, where it really doesn't matter what your house looks like, you're going to be able to sell it for a lot of money anyway. But in a lot of places, it really makes a difference. And people, they take pride in their yards, and they want to make it look that way. Now here it's a lot of mulch, but you're controlling those weeds really in this case for one reason only, and that's for aesthetics. We can't forget that, but it's not the only reason. And that's the problem, is a lot of times is people think that weeds are controlled just for aesthetics. They trap unsightly trash and debris. Now, this one's kind of interesting, and this gets more into the social sciences, which I am not. But you start looking at these sort of things, and my daughter lives in New York City, and when you go to a big city and you start to see weeds like this, and you start to see stuff growing like this, and litter starts to collect, and it maybe brings down the feeling around the neighborhood that maybe people don't care. And so it starts to degrade what the neighborhood's like just by having this. I mean, that may just be, again, aesthetics, but also it starts to trap trash and a lot of other things. I see someone put out that we need to support local agriculture. Yeah, and this is a thing I get a lot. It's pretty easy to support local agriculture in Northern California. It's really hard in the middle of Iowa or Nebraska where it's cold, and they have to get, food from other sources. We are very, very blessed here. I'm fourth generation Californians. I don't plan on going anywhere else, but we do have it pretty good here when it comes to being the #1 agricultural state in the country. Accelerate the breakdown of pavement. Again, I showed you this picture before. I was called out to the Napa County airstrip because the little weeds were growing in the cracks. And apparently pilots and the FAA don't like bumpy areas for the planes to land. So, controlling something like this for safety, really important. Hinder visibility. Now, this is one that gets me. So say this is a city-owned lot, and this person drives out and they can't see the person coming from the other side. Who's at fault? in these days, I can tell you who's going to be at fault. So there are, there's a lot of ways it can be controlled, but the fact that we just can't always let things open like this. Impact human health, bee stings, poison oak, allergies. So like I said, this isn't my picture, but I do carry an EpiPen, and I've seen this a lot in school districts where now that they're not doing really very high maintenance on their grass areas. There's gopher holes and a lot of other things. Kids aren't really encouraged to play outside. And I said there's a lot of bees out there, and and I tell people that it's really very personal for me. I tell people that and I am a little bit more controversial sometimes as a weed scientist than maybe I should be. Said sometimes we'll stop having any sort of peanuts in a school because one or two kids are allergic to peanuts. Yet we let the weeds grow. And I had some person say, well, you just have to be careful. Well, I'm a 6-year-old kid where I almost died because I was stung by a bee. So there really is, how do I stay away from the lawn when I'm asked to go out and play? So there again, maybe a reason to control weeds in certain circumstances. My whole backyard, I made sure that it was sort of bee not friendly, except for a couple bushes, just because of I didn't want to risk being stung. Fire. Now, this has been really tough talking to people about this, especially in the North Coast. I gave a presentation like this to the Ukiah Garden Club as the airplanes were still flying over, dropping the stuff to put the fires out with the retardant. So it's really kind of tough, and and we've in a lot of areas we've let the plants grow. People are really looking at why we're controlling weeds and what we're doing. Some of these weeds can be mowed, but oftentimes if they get too big because we don't have enough mowers to mow everything at once, then you mow and you lay the grass back down, and it's just another fuel source waiting to happen. So I see a question about mustard. Seems to be accelerating chaparral loss. Yeah, goats. Yeah, goats are good, but there's a lot of goats out now. I had someone come and do a presentation to the growers in Napa about sheep for all the vineyards, and I said, well, we have 100,000 acres of grapes in Napa and Sonoma together. I said, we need quite a few sheep. I said, I love lamb on Easter, but what do we do with all the sheep? We're going to have over 1 million. And you're not just going to do it for the fun, and where do they go? So again, goats are great on minor acreage, and we see them a lot. And I've seen the use of sheep in a lot of commercial vineyards, but just the numbers. And what if one of the goats gets out onto the road and someone's killed in an accident because they were trying to miss the goat? So it's not just like getting out there. These are the kind of things, again, I'm not trying to give anybody any answers. I'm 60 years old. I have I have my own opinions, and I don't want to change anybody's opinion about anything, but there's more to weeds than people think about. And how many millions of acres of roadsides we have in California. So it's sometimes just a scale issue. I have a few weeds in my yard. I really don't care. But certain things like this, I live in an area where fire's not a problem. So anyway, promote other pests, rodents. Now this, like I say, I think that I tell people that probably 30% of the grape growers in Napa do weed control strictly to keep the voles away from the grapes. And I know people don't really even understand the impact that this is a rat obviously growing. If you have stuff growing next to your house, you'll have more rats, and people seem to have no problem using baiting techniques or pesticides to kill their rats, where if they really got outside and made sure all the weeds around the house were there, they probably wouldn't have nearly as much rat infestation. But I had a grape grower growing grapes in Carneros region. They couldn't get in and do any kind of weed control. If they wanted to cultivate, it was too wet. They couldn't get in to actually get in and even spray the weeds. And they lost 1 in every 4 of their vines to voles, girdling the, and if you know about girdling, it will actually kill the vine. Now this wasn't that they lost the harvest for a year. These grapes died. So yeah. Yeah, the friend of mine is our state vertebrate pest person, and while your rat problem may have disappeared, they moved to somebody else's house. So you know, there's you can have certain certain things that keep your problem away, but when we look on a community level, we really have to look at what's going on. And others in camps. And this is not, like I tell people, this is not any kind of definition of the homeless issue, or this would cure the homeless issue. But you know, of any side on the edge of town where we do have some kind of especially tree of heaven population, there's oftentimes people hiding in here. Not for me. I'm not going to say that one way or the other, good, bad, or indifferent. But there are some places where they're used for shelter. And just again, another thing that people have to think about when they think about weed control. So this is, you know, back after that, just a long explanation of people, their first inclination when they think about weed control is always, well, people just don't want them because they don't look good. But there's a lot of things, again, you know, competition, you know, like I said, we are very blessed here with deep topsoil and great conditions. We can produce anything. We can probably have weeds and still, but there are a lot of areas in the world where we don't have the same kind of conditions that we do. But why are weeds invading? There's usually some sort of underlying factor. Poorly maintained areas, underlying problems. You know, with annual bluegrass, if you over-fertilize or have oxygen problems, like it's waterlogged, they do fine in that situation where most of your crops won't. Crabgrass, nutsedge, these plants, they love extra irrigated areas. Compacted soils, knotweed and spurge, sometimes they can tell you, you know, that your soil needs some sort of work because knotweed, as a matter of fact, is not a very good competitor. It grows where nothing else grows in hard compacted soils. It grows on the East Coast where there's salts that they use for to melt the ice or the snow. Lawns, low nitrogen fertilizer. So the legumes, you know, burr clover, black medic, white clover, the red clovers, you know, they will produce with the symbiotic relationship with the agrobacteria to make nitrogen. What's interesting here is that, you know, in the vineyards, we don't use nearly as much vetch as we used to. We've gone to a different species, some clovers, excuse me, and some fava beans and Austrian winter peas, because of vetch, the seeds, the birds moving the seeds. That vetch was actually growing every place else but in the vineyards. And when something gets outside, I mean, I was there 30 years ago, and we were starting to do a lot of cover crop work in California as part of the IPM program. A lot of people got in and planted vetch because, as I tell people, 30, 35 years ago, you had to be kind of a hippie to plant cover crops. Now it's become mainstream, but you really wanted to do good. These were people who were doing good. The problem is the vetch seed gets out, it lasts for 10 to 15 years. And when it gets out into our native low nitrogen soils that were better for our native perennial grasses, that it really started to help along with climate change, started to help the growth of our invasive European annuals, ryegrass, the wild oats, the ripgut brome, and all those other weeds, the annual weeds, because they had all this extra nitrogen. So now we've gone to plants that don't spread as much seed all over. Now in a localized area, oh, sorry, rhizobia. Sorry, not agrobacteria, rhizobia. As I'm winging it, you see how things go. But anyway, the rhizobia that will go with the legumes it's not the plant themselves. And most of the times we have enough active native in the soil, but if you're planting a cover crop, sometimes you do have to use an inoculum. Maintenance problems, thin areas in the lawn. You know, we've always talked about this, that if you have a lawn, and a lot of people have fewer and fewer lawns than we used to, but keeping it thick and healthy kept most of the weed problems out. So prevent weed introduction, and I tell people this all the time. So mowing lawns, or if you're using someone else's rototiller in your garden. Now I know oftentimes that this is standard practice to not spread diseases, but making sure that you keep the lawnmowers clean, your equipment clean, your rototillers clean, anything like that, so you're not spreading it from one field into the next. So it's interesting, is I probably should have to change this. This was a field in not a field, a landscape area in Anaheim, and you can see where the water had blown out. And I showed this picture saying, look, the nutsedge came back in. Well, I have to be honest, this isn't nutsedge. It's actually palm seedlings. Actually, when I went back 7 or 8 years later to this same spot, because it was a conference in that area, and I realized they were actually palm seedlings. And you get a lot of questions about palm seedlings as at the help desk. People go, what are these weeds growing under my palm trees? Well, it could be palm seedlings. But what happened here is that the story is still the same. Know your weed, know your soil source. Don't bring, if you have a hole in your yard, don't bring soil in from somewhere that you don't know if it's clean or not, because you can really bring in our area in Yolo, we could always tell somebody who went out to Cache Creek and just dug some cheap soil out and brought it home, because it almost always had some sort of nutsedge seedlings in it. So you really need to know where you're getting your compost, where you're getting your soil. Oftentimes you may have to spend a little bit more money to get good clean soil so you're not bringing something in. Limit area for weeds to grow. So, this is something that I've told a lot of people. A lot of the complaints about schools and cities was, well, we can mow up to the fence, but then we have to spray under the fence to keep the weeds down, because that's where they grow. We can't get our mowers. Well, something like this, and I tell the maintenance guys, I said, look, if we can get this into the construction budget to have cement under the or concrete under the fencing, you won't have to, it won't come out of your budget to do all the control there. You won't have to weed eat it. You can keep it out there. Again, here's another one up in the top. It's a plastic green, just something to keep the weeds from growing in areas where you really can't get to, because mowing will take care of most of them. Mulch. As I said before, as a master gardener, I know you have to take the mulch pledge. Raise your right hand and say, I will mulch whenever and whenever and wherever I can. And mulch is wonderful. And this is a site here in Woodland where they use some mulch. This slide is fairly old. They've done a good job of keeping the mulch up, and it's done an excellent job of controlling the weeds in that area. So this slide I had, this is they started a construction area and then stopped. So you can see what happened here. The moisture all concentrated in these little spots. And then the Russian thistle spinning around and getting in there and dropping its seeds. These other ones, they went in and pulled it out. But they really needed to put that stuff in and get it covered right away before it started to break down. So this, as I'm sure most of you recognize, is Disneyland. And I use this slide a lot. Someone asked about the, covering the surface of the soil from radiation and using water. Well, you can see here that what they've done here is they utilize a lot of very dense plantings, very few holes for weeds to grow in, just so they can, if the nutrients and water are there left for the weeds, they'll take it. So here's another planting. This again is in sort of a semi-commercial area in Woodland. Yeah, dense planting is great. And you can see what they've done here too, is that, and this slide's again fairly old. Some of you had a little bit of problem with some of the plants, but it's done a really nice job of keeping the weeds out. No mow fescue, N-O-M-O-W, no mow fescue. These deep fescues, this is a commercial area. This is in a big box area, big box store area in Woodland. And they've done a really nice job. There's been some weeds. You can mow it periodically, but you don't have to. Really does a nice job of competing with the weeds. But this was also planted during the drought. And if you notice that inset picture on the right, it did a good job of competing with this poor little tree that was then removed. Very, very competitive with holding on to the water, not letting it get in. So I got a question here real quick. A lot of my neighbors are using weed cloth in their landscape. How effective is it and for how long? Well, you know, it's funny, Ellen, is that we did research years ago using weed mulch, and you have to cover it. They don't say it in the instructions. You need to cover it with some kind of mulch or it will break down. But it can, depending on what kind it is, and we'll talk a little bit about more about that. It has to have, well, I'll talk about it now, and we'll just go through the slides then later. It has to be able to have oxygen and water penetration, because you don't want to use something like black plastic where you're going to have no interaction with water and oxygen. The soil will then become anaerobic and actually get that sort of sulfur smell, really be not of any good. The landscape fabric has to be covered with some sort of mulch. Most weeds will not grow through it. There are so many different kinds. Obviously, you'll want some that don't have very big holes in it, just enough for water and oxygen to permeate, but not much more than that. So this was I wanted to show you this, and this is another large experiment that I did. But down here on the cultivation, where no herbicides were used, you can see that this is, again, this transect with using 52 points. This is from a few years ago. And you can see where I did cultivation. What happened here is that an annual grass had been planted historically in the middles of the vineyard. When we cultivated and didn't spray, we moved the seed back under the vines, kept it pretty short, and you can see that the weed population, as opposed to some of the other treated ones, are very, very low. But what we had in this corner, the right-hand corner, is this above 85% of the area was covered with, at that point, which was dry grass. Earlier it was growing, but when I did the ratings, it was dry. So I've actually just expanded that corner over here. And what I'm showing you is the competition from this grass. And this is rat-tailed fescue or Zorro fescue is what it's called commercially. When it grows in the fall and winter, and then get to about this time of year, it senesces or dies. And the nice thing about this grass is that even with the drip irrigation from the vineyards, it will not start to grow again. It's pretty much done. Oftentimes, this same mixture has a brome grass called Blando brome. Blando will stay a little bit green if it gets an irrigation, and finally die when it gets really hot. Something like ryegrass. Unfortunately, with ryegrass, if you're to use ryegrass in this situation, as long as there is moisture present, ryegrass will continue to grow. So ryegrass would not work in this area, would compete with the vines as they're growing during the season. I'll go back. So the thing about this too is that I've been talking to some of the very large vineyard management companies and wineries about using this in their operations, because it won't compete for water. Now, a lot of the vineyards, and hopefully you'll be seeing these in the future as you go through, are having to buy mowers. Just a string mower. Most of them do not own mowers. It was really sort of surprising to me that they didn't, but they will have to if this gets much larger, and sometimes under the right conditions can get up to be a foot. They will have to mow around the vines to keep the voles from having habitat. But it can be a really great competitive when it's growing, and then also acting as a mulch after it dies. And this is, I think, a good situation in a lot of areas. Again, if you live in a fire-prone situation, it's not a huge fire source, but it can bring fires to another area. The other thing too is that when people don't think about having a densely planted cover crop or a cover, is that you have to think about the other weeds too. Now, I think in this area, it could be, not enough water or too much water. I think in this one, there was too much water, or it could have been hot water or some of these steam situations. This was taken at the UC Davis campus. Or it may have been a disease that got in, killed this cover, and you can see all the weeds coming in. So you see what a good job the cover is doing otherwise. But if there are areas where you get disease or have some other kind of situation, the weeds will just start to populate. And you can see it's everywhere in here. So here we talk again about the mulches real quickly. You know, block light and suppress growth, hold moisture in and reduce soil compaction and erosion, and improve soil. You can use anything, rocks, the fiber mulch, and this isn't plastic. I mean, it is an artificial material, but it's not black plastic. Or you can use organic mulch. So before I go, I want to ask you just a question, just on the basic difference. Anybody can tell me through a chat the basic difference between mulch and compost. It's a really simple answer. How it's used, that's actually, Jeff, that's pretty much the answer. The answer I was actually looking for is that compost is used to make things grow. Mulch is used to keep things from growing. So yes, how it's used. Can you use compost as mulch? Yes, you can. But it better be thick enough to keep the weeds from growing, because if it's thin enough, if it gets down and starts actually breaking down with the soil, which is what you want compost to do, then it not only not stops the weeds from growing, it makes them healthier. So you have to keep because compost by its very nature, you kind of want it to break down. So if you're going to use compost as a mulch, you better keep it really thick. Where some of these other organic mulches, the tree mulch, you know, oftentimes people have used redwood because it doesn't break down as fast. You don't have to use redwood, but watch whatever you're using as a mulch doesn't break down too quickly, especially right at that soil mulch interface, because it'll make the weeds even happier. So, but you can use all kinds of stuff. I tell people don't use black plastic unless you never want to use that soil again, or at least for the foreseeable future. I think that even if you were to use black plastic and say 10 years down the road, you decided that you wanted to maybe start using that soil again, you might have to plant a cover crop to maybe get it back in and start working again. Organic mulches, bark chips, paper, yard, you name it. Many materials can be used for mulch. This is some lava rock, probably just over from Lake County. Rocks, here we use some, these were almond shells and pecan shells. The problem with these is that they were secondary materials. There were little meats in here, and as soon as the birds saw that there were little nut meats in here, they kicked all of this stuff out. We had worked with a huge commercial nursery, and they were excited about using the stuff because they got it for almost nothing, and it looked really good, but man, there was none left. Once the birds found the meats in there, they kicked them all out. I think it's 10 after 11, so do we want to go for a little while longer? Do you want to take a quick break? Organizers, anybody?
Whatever you want to do. Do you want to take a 5-minute break?
Why don't we come back at 11:15 real quick?
Okay. Thank you, John.
You bet. Okay. I guess we're back. And everybody's settled in. We'll and thank you for kind of helping me learn through this. About this time, we would have gone a while ago. We'd have gone outside and looked at weeds and actually been able to talk to them, which for me is for me really enjoyable. I know the trainees enjoy it, but only nearly as much as I do, getting out and actually digging out weeds and talking about why they're there and what they have there. So this is new to me, and I know we're all under a lot of learning a lot of new things this way. I do hope that sometime in the future, maybe, like I said, there's a few classes, Marin, Sonoma, and Mendocino that I was planning on teaching this year. And while I am going to be retiring in July, I would hope to, maybe come back next year and teach a class. And at least some of you that are going through the training now would be able to show up for at least when we walk outside and take a look at weeds, because I think it's really great to see, as I tell people, see weeds in their native habitat. It's almost like instead of going to the zoo, you get to go on safari and actually dig them out and take a look at them. So hopefully we'll be able to do that in the future. I'd love to come back and do that. So with that said, let's keep moving on. Again, we talked a little bit about the mulches and the difference between compost and mulch. And really, when we do this, if you have fine mulches, you apply it 2 inches deep, but you have to keep it refilling it. Large mulches, medium size, 3 to 4 inches deep. The reason for this is we really want to keep the sunlight and the from getting to the soil. And if it's a smaller, finer mulch, you don't need as much to keep that sunlight from hitting the soil. It's amazing how little sun that weed seeds actually need. Work that was done in trying to do weed control at night, we found out that with a tractor you couldn't keep the lights on. That was enough light, just that flash of light for seeds to germinate. Dr. Tom Lanini did this work. He also found that trying to do it in during a full moon, it was too much of light to do weed control. So I think now using some sort of night vision technology, you could do it, but that gets a little crazy. But anytime we stir up weeds, the seeds will start to germinate. Synthetic mulches, you have to use it under something organic or rock mulches. I don't like, like I said, any kind of black plastic mulch, and we'll talk more about solarization and clear plastic. Again, these landscape fabrics allow air and water to pass and avoid sun exposure. I think that's what I said. They will break down. Having some sort of mulch on top is important. As we found in the test that we did, all the companies said, well, we said it didn't last as long as they said it did. They said, well, did you cover with mulch? I said, nowhere on your instructions does it say cover with mulch. So it really needs to be. And again, replenish as much as needed. And this is, really good too. Something like wild oats. If you get wild oats growing on top, they can germinate from 7 inches down in the soil. So their roots are pretty extensive. And oftentimes they'll grow on top. You just need to pull them out. And that's pretty easy. You may not control all the weeds with mulch, but it usually makes them pretty easy to pull out because their roots aren't going to be able to go through that mulch. Decomposed granite. It may not look great, but if you're really looking for an area with no weeds and really want to have no maintenance, really, the biggest thing is that people usually don't put their decomposed granite deep enough. So I get the question all the time. Oh, my camera just came off. Okay, I'm holding it on the window with tape, so I have a not quite right in my face. The thing about decomposed granite, people go, well, how deep should it be? My usual answer is so there's not any weeds coming through. Usually people who want to use it find it's more expensive than they thought it would be. But if you know somebody who's done it a lot, they can usually tell you how much. Straw mulch. Straw mulch is really, I think, a good thing. The thing is, you have to watch again here, as I talk about this a lot. Are things like gophers or voles, you don't know they're there. Anytime you have a mulch like this, you can't see underneath it. And make sure that you're using something that doesn't have a lot of seed heads in it. I have, I've had a lot of people complain that when they use barley straw or something, that there may be some more. The barley becomes the biggest weed you have. So hopefully that's not a problem, but you do need to watch out for stuff like that. Sheet mulching. I finally put this slide in a few years ago after getting so many questions from master gardeners, and I know a lot of people do this, and it can work very well. Again, though, it really comes down to, there's a science behind all of this. You don't want to put so many newspapers down there that it's blocking moisture and air from circulating. So again, you really don't want, and I tell people, and I haven't done the research to know how thick, but I tell people that, for me, it would be almost like using a weekday paper and not the Sunday paper. You don't want to use that thick that you're actually blocking. You want to be able to block the weeds from growing, but not so much that you're blocking moisture and air. And again, the thing about the plastics, we want to have water moving, somewhat between them. So you wouldn't want to use the glazed cardboard like you would for lettuce or those sorts of things, where you're just going to have a complete moisture barrier. So they can do a fantastic job. I know fewer people are getting newspapers anymore, but you still can. It still can be really good. It will eventually break down. We did some of this for a while. There was a product available that looked almost like the padded envelopes, but it was but like filled with shredded newspaper. And what I found is that we were putting some of it down, and it worked really well. I decided to cover it not with soil, but to cover it with wood mulch. Well, the problem is that after about a year being under wood mulch, it was gone. I think when you use something like the paper mulch, it broke down very, very quickly. It wasn't this padded thing. It wasn't really very thick. So you have to watch that it isn't that it under the right conditions of moisture and sunlight, it can break down very quickly. So you're gonna have to keep an eye on this. It's not like the excuse me, the landscape fabrics that will stay on for quite a while. Mulch summary again. Remember the purpose of mulch is to keep plants from growing. Purpose of compost is to help them grow. You can use just about anything, but mulches tend to increase soil moisture retention, and they cool off the soil. Now that's great in the summertime. Maybe not so good if you're trying to get an early crop out. You know, sometimes you have to really watch the changes in the soil. Increased soil moisture retention. I've had some people say that, you know, having mulch really close around trees can cause, you know, crown disease. And again, I'm not a pathologist, and it really depends on your tree and the health of your tree and the susceptibility to that. But oftentimes you see people just sort of keep it away from the tops of the trees as close as you can, but not over the top. Again, never let weeds go to seed. So this is when we talk about IPM, integrated pest management, I guess, ideas. You know, the big thing was that the entomologists always talk about an economic threshold. When plants get to a certain density, then you control them. With weeds, it's really kind of tough, and we'll talk about the seed numbers. You can let weeds grow, you just can't ever let them really go to seed. You know, I like showing this picture. This was this. It doesn't look like there's many that are that dry, but we were working in a vineyard with a USDA researcher who was wearing tennis shoes. So this was after just part of a day, and you can see those little foxtail seed heads are in there, just all in her shoes. And I made her stop and take a picture before she cleaned it out. So this is something, and those of you who know fillery, the fillery plant, this is scissors, and some of you. You know, it's funny is that when I talk about this in the class, I ask people if they ever played scissors with these, and half the class looks at me funny, and the other half shakes their head up and down. So it really is kind of funny. To make scissors, you cut a little hole in the right in here with your fingernail, and you push this one through. It was a kind of an easy game. But the interesting thing about fillery, and this is one of the fun things that I like to show, is if you can find one of the seed heads that's the seeds are still in there. There's 4 seeds in there, but it's dry. This is my wife, my assistant, the other day when we went out. You can see that, yes, it played on scissors as a kid. You can see here that this happened immediately after when you get them dry enough, they will start to spin, and it's the most amazing thing. This seed is drilling itself into the ground. You can't really see the seed head itself. It's right here, and it's got those backward little hairs like the ripgut brome does. And what it does is it sticks in the soil. It starts to twist, and this twisting pushes it into the soil as it dries out. And you can watch them in the sun. It's just amazing to watch them spin. In the morning, if there's dew, it starts to unravel, but the seed can't move out. And then when it dries up again, it starts to spin again, pushing it farther into the soil. So this plant actually buries itself. It's pretty cool. Sorry. Weed seed banks represent the reservoir of seeds, and we all know this. Yeah, you need to get the fillery. It's really cool. I used that at Picnic Day in Davis, which has been canceled this year. I had a whole bunch of kids just swarming all over me. because I have to compete with the bugs and then the chemistry show. So it was a lot of fun. But there's just a whole bunch of seeds in the soil, and I think we all know that. They come from two places. Either either your yard, or they come from your neighbor's yard, or from pots and outside equipment. We've found that, and some of the vineyards now, going back to that where I spend a lot of my time, a lot of the growers now have gone to these potted plants for replanting, and we're bringing a lot of weeds in those pots. Anytime you bring a plant home, make sure you check it for weeds before you plant it in your vineyard, in your yard or vineyard. So I love these numbers, and you can see at the bottom, nobody wants to do this work. Dr. Stevens in 1954, 1957 made a bunch of his graduate students count these weed seeds. But this is from a single plant, and these numbers are usually pretty low. I did some work with Dr. Robert Norris at UC Davis when I was a technician there for years. We planted one barnyard grass plant as a transplant, gave it all the water and fertilizer it needed. The plant, if you know how these plants grow, they grow and then they tiller, and so we let it grow just basically unobstructed. Had some plastic out so we could collect all the seeds, and we got somewhere over 900,000 seeds from one plant. So so you really need to, so the economic threshold, as we say for weeds, for going to seed is 0. Now you can let them grow and keep them mowed and those sorts of things, but you really don't want a lot of these seeds. A redwood pigweed plant, over 100,000 seeds from one plant. So you really need to take a look, because you've done all this weeding. Next year they're all back. And I love this slide. Now these, as I told you before, groundsel seeds last about a year in the soil, but if you put it in a dry area, storing them, they last 58 years. This is my favorite one, the lamb's quarter. They must have found it, I don't know, in a sarcophagus or something, but 1,700 years. But it had to be dry, but they'll never last that long in the soil. Especially some of these smaller seeds, they're broken down by microbes and moisture over the years very quickly. What's interesting is that yellow star thistle, another nasty weed, we find that it breaks down. The seeds only last about 3 years in the soil. I think people think that star thistle lasts forever in the soil, and it's the worst weed ever. But it, except if you're making honey or feeding sheep, actually. But it in the soil, in a wet year, it breaks down very, very quickly in a year or two at most. So control methods, the really fun part. So cultivation and tillage, hoeing and pulling, flaming and mowing, all the neat things. So I like to make sure, because I grew up working in a farm, so that I have to know that cultivation, I'll go back to this slide first, it means to, this one, by plowing, fertilizer, raising crops, loosen or dig soil around growing plants. So this is like with a disc or something where you're cultivating, you're moving the soil around. Because someone asked me one time, well, John, doesn't cultivate mean to make a plant better? It does. I'm using the disking and moving soil around one. So, and these are very simple. This is not brain surgery. It's very, very simple techniques. Best when weeds are small, of course. Dry conditions after cultivation help prevent rerooting. So if you're watering every week, you want to get in, unless you're pulling the weeds out and taking them in a bag with you, which is also a good idea. You want to hoe the weeds out and let them dry before you water again. Shallow cultivation reduces the quantity of new seeds brought to the surface. Very, very important. And I'll talk about that when I talk about the hoes themselves. Cultivation, cut below the soil surface to reduce root carbohydrate. Repeat cultivation at 2 to 3 weeks intervals during the growing season. So if you have some of those perennials that you want to try to repeatedly cultivate, I tell people this is when it's really nice maybe to live in the upper Midwest, where the growing season is only a few months long. We all know how long the growing season is in Northern California. 11 and a half months. So you get out there and you have to cultivate this all the time. You can reduce the population of some of these, even with the bindweed. You can eventually. It's just it may take 2 or 3 years. So I want to answer this question real quickly with Jeff about the liverwort. I see a lot of nursery stock with liverwort now. Is liverwort a problem once plants get planted into the garden? I don't think where I live in Woodland, Jeff, it would be a problem. I think if you live in a coastal area, it is. But but I can tell you we did research with the liverwort 25 years ago down in Half Moon Bay, where it was, you know, I tell people that people who move from Half Moon Bay are scared because they see that big orange thing in the sky. You know, the sun very rarely shines there, yet they're irrigating all the time. And they actually, the Nurserymen's Exchange hired a few people. Their whole job was just to skim the liverwort out of the pots. I think if you live in an area where it stays cool and moist, liverwort, because of the way it spreads by droplets and irrigation and moving around and keeping the water, I think it could be. Where I live, it wouldn't be. So I think if it gets a chance to dry out, it's really interesting. Actually, liverwort was tough because trying to do anything with liverwort, what we found that worked best with liverwort was some of the cuticle burning organic herbicides, because basically they just burn the cuticle off of plants, and that's all you really needed. It worked better than any other kind of conventional or anything else because of the way they work. It worked pretty well. But the best thing was the people they had using their thumbs to clean the liverwort out. Sorry, I love answering these questions. So anyway, you can do it, but it takes a while. You know, hoeing. You know, hoeing hasn't changed in a long time. Now you're able to wear short pants. But what's interesting, and this is something that people don't think about, in that depending on the kind of hoe you use really makes a difference. This one here, this should only be used to knock big weeds down, because every time you put that hoe in the ground, you pull seeds to the top that maybe never would have seen the sun, and you've opened up the soil for seeds to see. If you have a choice, something like this hula hoe, which is a brand name, or these, you know, something under the soil or under your mulch to get the weeds without moving as much soil. As I said before, just a little bit of sunlight can really make more seeds germinate. Propane flamers. Oh my God, everybody loves these. I had a lady one time ask if she could use a flamethrower to kill weeds. I said, it's not quite the same thing, but if you do it, can I get a video? So the interesting thing about these flamers is that, of course, I love this picture, and this is in the old IPM manual and in the new one. No matter how skilled you are, never use a flamer on dry wood chips while you're standing on it. But these weeds are a little too big. When you use something like this propane flamer, think of the flame as an electric heater, because you're not burning the weeds, you're using the heat from the flame. So basically what you're doing is you want to heat the plants up so that they boil the water on the inside, breaking the cell wall. The plant then actually dies of desiccation. So as much fun as it is to burn weeds to the ground, that's not what you're doing. You don't want to do it when weeds are dry. You want to do it when they're young and succulent. This is great here, you know, like in the cracks of the of pavement. And this picture here is great because you're able to get the small weeds around the tomato plant here. Even if you burned a few of the edges of the leaves, it's fine because you can get the weeds around the edge. So this is what you want to look at. You want to look for this matte finish. This weed is pretty big. This was a commercial flamer in a vineyard, organic vineyard I worked with the grower on. And you can see that this plant is going to die down. Again, one of the things, and I think it's on the next slide, you see all the grass? Why do we see grasses? Because the growing point for grasses is at or below the soil level, where the growing point for this plant is up above, so we can actually kill some of the growing points. But the thing about it is, once you see in these organic flame weeded vineyards, is that we start to see grass, and these dry grass leave this skeleton. And this was the middle of winter. We really had to watch out for, you always have to watch out for flame. Mowing, you know, may require repeated operations. And we do use a mower. The thing about it is you're going to start looking at, you'll have more grass when you mow, just like because of where the growing point is. You'll have more dandelion. You'll have more perennials. So it can work, but you have to watch out for that weed shift. Anytime you do any kind of weed control over and over and over, just like the using of an herbicide, you will see a shift in the plant population. Animals, You know, I've done a lot of work with sheep in some commercial vineyards. Goats are fantastic if you want to get out and kill uh, brush and poison oak and those sorts of things. If you have a small vineyard or an orchard, goats are, I don't know the technical term, but I like to tell people anytime there's goats, there's a lot of shenanigans. You know, they like to, they love fun. They're browsers, not grazers, where they're set up to eat the stuff that looks more like a vine than sheep are. Sheep are going to eat grass. Goats are great for browsing. You know, this is a commercial vineyard up in the Dunnigan Hills in Yolo, and this is not, the next picture is not the same vineyard, but it's one that looked like this before they sent the sheep in. They do a fantastic job. Now we're looking at 400 or 500 sheep per acre using electric fence. They do an excellent job, and a lot more vineyards are looking at using sheep at certain times of the year. Some vineyards are even looking now at raising the trellising up so they can keep sheep in more often. It works really well in vineyards where we actually bottle the grapes. Some of the other orchards and stuff, because of worried about disease, I guess salmonella and other things. I'm not exactly sure, but they want to make sure that the sheep are out 60 days or 90 days before harvest. You know, they work really well. Oh, solarization. Okay, as we get down close to the end of time here, fantastic. We did a lot of work with solarization. It works really well where I live in Woodland, because we get hot summer days. And probably the best place, maybe in the country where it works best, is down in the where they grow vegetables down in the southeastern deserts of California, because it's too hot in the summertime to grow anything. So they put this plastic out then, and then in the fall they're able to when they start to grow fall and winter, they've done a great job of and they do thousands of acres of this solarizing down there, because they're able to utilize the heat. If you live on the coast, you're going to have to go for the sunniest days, because when it comes to solarization, we're not looking for the warmest days. We're looking for the longest days, because the way the solarization plastic works is the short waves of light from the sun go through the plastic, and at night when the long waves are being re-radiated, they don't make it out. So you want the best time to do solarization, depending on the clearness, would be around the longest day. So starting June 1st, going for those 3 weeks up to June 21st, and then 3 weeks after. So you can do it later, and especially if you live near the coast, you're going to have to do it in that fall season. The weed seeds, you don't need to get nearly as hot where you are, because the weeds are growing in a cooler climate than when we do in the Central Valley. We did this work years ago where we did paired plots all the way down the coast, looking at, we could kill purslane with solarization better if we brought the seeds over, because we did this, bringing seeds from one to the other, that we got it hotter here. We could kill the weed seeds then. And if you can kill most of the purslane seeds, they do like the heat though. But it does kill a lot of weeds. Someone had a question before. It does kill a lot of the annual weeds. One of the things we found, if you have nutsedge, you need to let the nutsedge germinate before you put the plastic on. If not, that sharp little point will poke right through the plastic. The other thing we found out about solarization is that you have to, if you have any holes, you have to make sure they're patched, because the heat will release, keeping the soil warm enough for weeds to germinate, but not hot enough to kill them. So they act like a greenhouse and not like a killing. So anytime you have dogs or shade, or you can't let irrigation get on top of the plastic, because as that water evaporates, it'll cool. If you know you have deer or something else, you need to have a little roll of Scotch tape to go out and plug those holes. Birds will see if there's condensation on the plastic. The birds will poke holes. You have to get those. Jeff has a question about how well the solarization work on creeping perennials. You know, it can work okay on Bermuda grass. It won't work on the Johnson grass and some of the other ones. Okay on nutsedge. The thing about Bermuda grass is, and I know it may not get hot enough where you are, but if you can get the Bermuda grass rhizomes out on top of the soil and let them dry out and rake them out, you may not get all of it, which you can get a lot of it, but you need to get it out of the soil and dry it out, and hopefully not get too much moisture, hopefully not too much heavy fog where maybe you live, but it can work. It won't do a great job depending on how deep the rhizomes are, because we're not going to get much heat, really killing heat much below 4 to 5 inches. It can go a little bit deeper, but anything below that is going to be tough. And then once you solarize, you can't bring up soil from other places. So you need to make sure your beds are pretty much done by then. So again, get a bunch of friends, tie it down as closely as possible. It does a great job. And here we do have a great thing on soil solarization. Okay, so I do have a few more minutes, and I have a whole presentation on herbicides, but I'm going to, on pesticides, but what I really want to do in the short time I have left is get down and talk about the work that we've done with organic herbicides, because we have I get a lot of questions about organic herbicides. Wear your proper PPE, even if you're going outside now. So, kind of a joke, I guess. We don't. Okay, so it's about 20 minutes to 12. So I get a lot of questions about organic and alternative herbicides, and of course from cities and everything else. So you know, again, like anything else, we can make them work. They don't fit in every situation. As I tell people, you know, we've spent the last 2 hours talking about ways to keep weeds, knowing what the weeds are, keeping from growing, mulching, and those sorts of things. But I get a lot of questions about this. So organic herbicides, you know, spray cover is essential. Some of the newer herbicides, we're getting down below the 70 gallons per acre, that's not sprayed to wet, but that's pretty wet. They work best on clear sunny days because almost all of them now are just killing or skimming through the cuticle, so those plants die almost like if they were using a flamer, which means that they will grow back just like the flamer does, unless the smaller the better. Work better in warm weather. Organic surfactants, we're still working with this. This is something before maybe organic surfactants aren't as much help as just maybe upping the rate a little bit. Treat when weeds are small. Of course, repeat applications are going to be needed for most larger weeds. So this is the one thing that, you know, when we start talking about home remedies and all those other things, that's one thing. You know, I get a lot of questions. Some people have asked me about salt. You know, you don't want salt. I mean, if you don't want anything to grow, use salt. But it's not going to keep things from growing. And this is the exempt list. You know, some of these, I don't know if I have the list. No, some of these are used as herbicides. Citric acid. Now, watch out for citric acid. Anytime that's in any of organic herbicides, it's going to have a danger label because of eye damage. We have clove oils, some other things in here. It's just, this is the 25B list. You can take a look at this. But so this is some, I want to show you this very quickly. Some work that we did. We start talking about the cost of some of these herbicides. And again, when we start talking about scale, what their cost is for the treatments we used, and I'll actually show you more of that later. But looking over here, mostly on your left-hand side, the signal words. The suppressed is a organic herbicides warning. Weed farm is acetic acid. It's a danger. Avengers caution. This limonene. It's harder to find now. The ammonium nanoate, a warning. Weed Zap is a 25B, and it's actually a caution. I don't know why I got in there. Burnout, which is one you see a lot in the stores. If you buy the concentrated version, it says danger. If you buy the ready-to-use, it's a caution. The difference between the ready-to-use, yeah, I've used, and which, you know, it won't. Yeah, the question about will the burnout kill the rhizomes? It will not. It burns off the top. But when you buy the ready-to-use, well, the concentrated says it's a quart, and it says mix with 3 quarts. So it's going to be more expensive, but the thing about these organic herbicides, be careful when you're mixing them. But once you mix them, the huge danger is it's all because of eye damage. So be careful with that. So anyway, so here's the burnout label and the Weed Zap label. Weed Zap is clove and cinnamon oil, very high rates. It's use it sparingly unless you want to smell like Christmas all year long. It really smells good right away, but after a while, it's pretty sickening. But it works okay. Weed Zap, Nothing works faster than Weed Zap, but in doing some research plots, in mixing this and then going back and getting another one, when I've come back after 5 minutes, you can already start to see them turn black. But again, it's not going to get anything underground, but if you get the weeds when they're small, it works pretty well. Suppress is one that's mostly used now in organic vineyards and organic agricultural uses. Hopefully they're going to be doing more and more with homeowners. I keep pushing them for schools and homeowners, but they haven't changed the label yet. Fiesta and this is the chelated iron. This is it's really amazing. It'll kill some of your small broadleaves in a lawn or area where they can compete and grow back. I've seen some really good results with some very large broadleaf weedy plants, and other times not. But it's selective to kill only the broadleaves, and sometimes it works really well, and other times it doesn't. But it's been amazing where it has worked. Avenger works okay. I'm not sure it's being made anymore. This D-limonene, it was a green match for a long time. And these are two that are not organic, but they're alternatives. They're both fatty acids. I think they're oftentimes, the Final Sand O is actually organic. Oftentimes these are alternative and can be considered organic, but if you're farming a CCOF, I guess they don't like the way it's made. I think it's synthetically made, so they don't like that, but it is an alternative herbicide. Weed Farm, which is the acetic acid. I get a lot of questions about acetic acid. If you notice, this is 20% acetic acid. This isn't 5% like your normal vinegar. It's not going to work that well. This works pretty well. You do have to wear a mask using this. It's the only time in 14 years of being a farm advisor where I had to shave my beard and wear a mask when I worked with the ag commissioner up in Lake County. I did some other work and I decided it's just vinegar. I pulled the mask off. It's hard to breathe when you're using a spraying it with a mist in front. Of course, it's all acute, but be careful. It's pretty it's pretty tough stuff. I got a question about what's the best way to kill poison oak. These organic herbicides are not going to do it. If you go to the store, you can find Brush Be Gone, pretty intense herbicide. If not, buy a bunch of goats. Goats will do a pretty good job on poison oak, but Brush Be Gone will work on poison oak. But again, it's a conventional herbicide. So this is a test we did real quick in the last few minutes. I want to get to this. We got a call from Sac State saying, hey, we want to reduce our glyphosate use. Can you help us out? Because, we get a lot of these questions. People want to use something else. They don't know how to use them. So this is our site. It's in the shade, which is interesting because, all these organic herbicides work better in the sun, yet most of the weeds are in the shade. So we got this site. It was just before school started in a parking lot. I forgot what they called this area, but they got mad at us for killing their lawn. I said, well, they'd already done a good job about killing it. It wasn't very good. But this is what we used. And you can see we had this Fiesta, Weed Slayer, Final Sand, Weed Zap, Burnout, Avenger, Axe, Scythe, almost all of them. And then at the bottom, we did use Finale, which is an alternative, but is a conventional. And of course, Ranger Pro is the glyphosate that they used as their standard. And then we did not use Nature's Wisdom because the young man who was doing the applications, this is the only one that really required a mask, and he was not willing to use it, so we dropped it out. We wanted to show the price of it. So this is what the plot looked like. Pretty good. We actually got really good control with some of these, and I'll show you the data. Oops. So this is on a 1 to 10 rating. This is for grasses. And you can see that, we did okay on some of the grasses, not great. Scythe did a fantastic job early after a second application. This is 1 day after a second application, looked good, really looked good. And then the grass starts to grow back 50 days after the second application. But they did okay. Weed Slayer, a new herbicide. We're still trying to figure out what exactly it is. Seems to do okay after a second application. Of course, the Roundup did a really good job. Oh, so, and I'll show you here on the grasses, and you can barely see that it's just a little bit of data chart. And you can see that they all did really well, and then some of them start to either dance around and fall back down. Broadleaves. Now, we did put the, we didn't have the Fiesta in the, into the grasses because it only kills broadleaves. And by the end, it didn't do a very good job, I think because they were growing back. But we had another test where it just did a fantastic job on some big luxuriant grasses. Final sand did okay, but you can see they all start to grow back after a while. A second application is most definitely going to be needed for a lot of these. But this is what I wanted to show is the price of these. So we did 2 applications. So this is the cost on 1,000 square feet. And this is the kind of stuff that people need to take into consideration. So for the finale and the Roundup, we didn't make a second application when we did one. So this was the total cost for 1,000 square feet in this trial, what it would have cost. You can see this is what people are looking at, is some increased costs for their applications. And you can see that if we did the Nature's Wisdom, it would be really outrageous. But what I have told people, and as we finish, I think this is what I'm going to finish on, is that I've told the cities that, you know, they all kind of got, or the cities and schools, they kind of got lazy. You know, they spray the weeds in their parking lot instead of maybe resurfacing their parking lot. They didn't spend the money on mulches because they had glyphosate they could go out and spray. And I tell people now, if they are willing to spend money now because their budgets are going to have to go up for weed control if that's what they choose to do. If they would spend the money now to mulch, to change irrigation, to fix all that stuff, to repave their parking lots, it's going to be more expensive for the next 3 or 4 years. But after that, I think their budgets for weed control would go down from where they are now, from, you know, getting out and spraying and having somebody do it. But it's going to take some strength for people to go, look, now you need to put this mulch in that you don't really do a very good job. And you've all seen these schools. You can see why the cities, why the weeds are growing there. They're just open areas, or they haven't really done a good job, or they haven't done the planting. The problem is it's going to take some people standing up and saying, look, we need to spend, you know, 5 times as much in the next 3 years as we have over the last few years so we can save money in the future. As I told the Board of Supervisors in one county, unfortunately, it takes about 4 years, and that's your election cycle. So anyway, with that, oh, I just wanted to show you one last real quick thing is that anytime you spray these things, you better control the weeds early, because we got great control one day after. This is weeds that were 19 days old, 15 days after treatment. We had almost half control. And if the weeds were 26 days old when you treated, 15 days after that, we got almost no control. And you can see this for the grasses. If the grass was 12 days old when you sprayed it, we got pretty good control. If it was 19 days old when you sprayed it, 15 days after, yeah, it was okay. If the weeds were 26 days old when you sprayed them, the grasses, 15 days after treatment, the best we had was 8% control. So you do need to control these weeds when they're small. Okay. Is there research on how these herbicides impact the soil biome? You know, there is some. In fact, one of the experiments I did, this is from Glenda, the trial that I did up in Hopland. We were looking at organic herbicide plus cultivation, Roundup plus an organic a pre-emergent herbicide. And one of our graduate students is a soil scientist, so she's actually taken the herbicide from the soil from the organic herbicide and from the Roundup treated and from the cultivating, and she's looking at the soil. So the results aren't quite done yet. Oh, camera's moving again. It's It's getting warm outside here, and my tape is not holding in the window. Okay, I'll do the best I can. So, any questions? Any more questions? I know it's a lot to take in, but hopefully I can come back out at some point.
What is the mechanism on the tumbleweed that cuts it loose?
It develops an abscission layer, so it starts to basically kill those the cells at the stem start to die. So it just unhooks itself, so that it starts to as some things do with seeds. So it really starts to cut off. So
Thank you.
you bet.
Fascinating.
Oh, it is. Yeah, and I kind of laid into that person who said, well, they just get dry and they die. No, they're doing more than that. I'm a little sensitive about weeds. Anybody else? I know it's a lot to take in, and this is why I usually get people a chance to get outside and look at weeds. It's kind of we go out and identify them. Hopefully we'll have a chance to do that sometime in the future. It's really a lot of fun for me. But you have my email address. At least for the next few months, I'm not going anywhere apparently. So if you want to send me some pictures or something like that, I'm always here. And as we like to tell people, even though we're not in our office, we are still working. So hopefully I can help. So, and I was really looking forward to a beautiful day in Marin. It looks like it's going to be spectacular today. So get outside and kill some weeds or eat some weeds, whatever it is you want to do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bet.
Any other questions for John?
I guess got one. Why is the cost so high for schools if cardboard and wood chips are free? Well, labor. And just getting and doing stuff. They, something like, they spray a lot. We're doing a lot of work with steamers in their parking lots to kill the weeds in the cracks because they don't want them to break down. But they just keep going over and over and over instead of, being able to have, school budgets are pretty tight. So, and oftentimes people get a little upset when they're talking about anything except for teachers. So it's, I spent, in my early age, I spent 4 years on a planning commission. So I learned that sometimes what you think is good for the people, they don't always agree. And if you make 50% of the people happy and 50% of people are mad at you, you're probably doing a good job. All right. I don't see any last minute questions that, all right. Well, and the thing is what, as Master Gardeners, you are, and I'm a huge proponent of the Master Gardener program, and I keep pushing. I'm on a few committees with A&R that, we really need to help our Master Gardeners help us. So if you have any weed questions, you're more than welcome to send them to me if I can help. Like I tell people though, if you send me a question or ask me a question, you have to promise me that you won't be angry or offended if my answer isn't what you expect it to be. I've been doing this 38 years. I've done work. I tell people I've done work we did work with alternatives to methyl bromide, did everything from chemicals that were worse than methyl bromide to using broccoli. So every kind of weed question that you can imagine, every time a control method, and economics comes into and just scale. I haven't watered my front lawn for 3 years, and hopefully this year when I retire, I'll actually be able to do something else with it. But my friends come over and point out the weeds in my yard. So I tell them I'm not going to do anything because I'm taking it out. So anyway, all right.
John, thank you so much. This is Kay Jones speaking.
Yep.
It's great to know that you'll be a continuing resource for us.
Yes, I would love. My wife's been retired for 2 years, and I've been with the university 38 years. It's not the kind of job you can do part-time, so I think the best thing for me to be able to do is to go ahead and retire and retain an emeritus status, and that way I can help the. I did tell them that one of the reasons I want to do that is to be able to teach a few Master Gardener classes, maybe not as many as I did in the past, but at least maybe the North Coast people who I've and especially you people that kind of missed out this year. I mean, maybe bragging, but I'm fantastic outside. So,
Can't wait.
all right. So
Thank you so much.
you bet. I'm going to go ahead and then get out. So take care. And you have the presentations. If you go over them, look at them later, have some questions for me, make sure you send them. So, all right, y'all, stay safe. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you,
You
John.
bet.